The watch had belonged to Samuel Okafor for 31 years before it belonged to his son for 11 days, and on the 12th day, his son had carried it into a pawn shop on Delmar Avenue in St. Louis and set it on the counter and asked, in a voice that was working very hard to sound steady, how much he could get for it. The boy's name was Desmond Okafor. He was 19 years old. His father had died 11 days earlier on a Tuesday morning in March, from the cancer that had been moving through him for 14 months, a span of time during which Desmond had watched his father go from a man who coached youth basketball at the community center on weekends to a man who needed help standing up from a chair. The specific and merciless arithmetic of terminal illness reducing his father, week by week, into something smaller than the person Desmond had known his entire life. Samuel had raised Desmond alone since Desmond was 4. After Desmond's mother had left in circumstances Samuel had never fully explained and Desmond had eventually stopped asking about, understanding somewhere in his teenage years that some questions are not actually about getting an answer, but about whether asking them will reopen something better left closed. What he knew, pieced together from fragments over the years, was that his mother had struggled with addiction in ways that had made staying impossible for her and dangerous for Desmond, and that his father had never once spoken about her with bitterness, only a quiet and complicated sadness that surfaced rarely and was never directed at Desmond himself. Samuel had worked for 26 years as a maintenance supervisor for the city's parks department, a steady, unglamorous job that had been enough, combined with careful management and a refusal to spend money on anything that was not strictly necessary, to raise a son in a small but well-kept apartment on the north side of the city, to keep that son fed and clothed and supplied with the specific things that mattered to Samuel even when money was tight, books, mostly, and the entry fees for the basketball leagues Desmond played in throughout his childhood, leagues that Samuel eventually started coaching himself. First because the previous coach had quit and someone needed to step in, and then because he discovered, in his late 30s, an unexpected gift for working with kids that he had not known he possessed. The watch had been a gift from Samuel's own father, Desmond's grandfather, a man named Eustace Okafor, who Desmond had never met, who had died before Desmond was born, a Nigerian immigrant who had arrived in the United States in 1961 with almost nothing and had worked 30 years in a steel mill in Gary, Indiana before retiring with very little to show for it beyond a small pension and the specific dignity of a man who had supported his family without complaint through decades of difficult and dangerous labor. The kind of work that wore down hands and backs and lungs, but that Eustace had always described, according to Samuel, as honest work that fed his children, which to him was the only measure of a job's worth that ultimately mattered. Eustace had bought the watch, a simple but well-made mechanical piece, second-hand in 1968, with money he had saved for almost a year, and had given it to Samuel on the occasion of Samuel's high school graduation, the first member of their family to complete that particular milestone, with the specific instruction, which Samuel had repeated to Desmond many times over the years, that the watch was meant to mark the moment a boy understood that his future was something he was now responsible for building himself. Samuel had worn the watch every day for 31 years. Through his own difficult early adulthood, through the loss of Desmond's mother, through 26 years of maintenance work that had been hard on his hands and his back, but that he had never once described to Desmond as beneath him, through the slow accumulation of a life built carefully and without much margin for error. He had given the watch to Desmond 2 weeks before he died, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and the specific exhaustion of a long illness, and had said, in a voice that had grown thin by then but had not lost its essential steadiness, that the watch was Desmond's now, that it had marked the moment his own father understood Samuel's future belonged to him, and that Samuel hoped it would mark the same thing for Desmond. Even though the circumstances of the handoff were not the ones, either of them would have chosen Desmond, had worn the watch every day for the 11 days between his father's death and the morning he carried it into the pawn shop on Delmar Avenue, and the decision to pawn it had not been made lightly or quickly. It had been made over the course of those 11 days, through a specific and unforgiving mathematics that Desmond, at 19, found himself navigating largely alone for the first time in his life. Samuel's death had not come with significant savings attached to it. The 14 months of illness had eaten through what modest reserves Samuel had built over his career, medical costs that insurance had covered only partially, the specific financial erosion that long illness brings even to families who had managed their money carefully. There was a small life insurance policy through Samuel's job with the city, but the payout, Desmond had learned in a difficult conversation with a benefits administrator 3 days after the funeral, would take 6 to 8 weeks to process, a timeline that did nothing to address the rent due on the apartment Desmond was still living in, the apartment he had grown up in, the apartment that represented in a very literal sense the only home he had ever known. Desmond was 3 semesters into a degree in mechanical engineering at a local university, attending on a partial scholarship that covered tuition but not living expenses, working part-time at a hardware store on weekends and a few evenings during the week to cover the gap. A fragile financial arrangement that had functioned only because Samuel had been able to cover rent and the larger household expenses through his city salary. With Samuel gone and the insurance payout still weeks away, Desmond was facing a specific and immediate crisis. Rent due in 4 days, $420 he did not have, and no clear path to getting it beyond the kinds of desperate measures that 19-year-olds in this position have always had available to them, measures that mostly involved giving up something that mattered in exchange for something that mattered more urgently. He had considered, and rejected, several other options before the watch, lying awake at night cycling through every possibility he could think of. He had asked his hardware store manager for an advance on his paycheck and been told, not unkindly but firmly, that the store's policy did not allow it. He had reached out to a cousin in Memphis who he knew had some money but who, it turned out, was navigating his own financial difficulties and could offer only $40, which he sent immediately and apologetically. He had looked with a specific and exhausting thoroughness through every closet and drawer and box in the apartment, through everything he and his father had owned, trying to identify anything else of value he could sell, and had found almost nothing. The household having been built deliberately, around necessity rather than accumulation, Samuel having spent 3 decades avoiding exactly the kind of possessions that could be liquidated in an emergency because he had never had the margin to acquire them in the first place. The watch was, in the end, the only thing of meaningful value Desmond had access to. He had held it for a long time on the night before he took it to the pawn shop, sitting on the edge of his bed in the apartment that felt, in the 11 days since his father's death, both completely familiar and entirely strange. The specific texture of grief that makes ordinary spaces feel different once the person who animated them is gone. He thought about his grandfather, a man he had never met, saving for almost a year to buy this watch in 1968. He thought about his father wearing it for 31 years, through everything that 31 years had contained. He thought about what it meant that the watch had been given to him. Twice now, in moments meant to mark the beginning of independence. His father's graduation and now his own entry into an adulthood that had arrived faster and harder than either of them had wanted. He decided, finally, somewhere around 2 in the morning, sitting alone in a quiet apartment that had never before felt this empty, that his father would have wanted the rent paid more than he would have wanted the watch kept. A calculation that felt, even as he made it, like a kind of betrayal he was choosing anyway, because the alternative, losing the apartment, losing the last physical space where his father's presence still lingered in the specific arrangement of furniture and the particular smell of the kitchen and the small accumulated evidence of a life lived there for 15 years, felt like a larger and more unacceptable loss. The pawn shop on Delmar Avenue was owned by a man named Ruben Castellano, who had run the shop for 23 years, inheriting it from his own father, who had opened it in 1979. Ruben was 61 years old, a heavy-set man with reading glasses that lived permanently on a chain around his neck, who had developed over more than 2 decades behind the counter a specific and reliable instinct for the difference between people who were pawning items as part of an ordinary transactional relationship with the shop, People who used pawn shops the way some people use credit cards, as a routine tool for managing cash flow, and people for whom walking through his door represented something closer to a crisis, a last resort arrived at after exhausting every other option. Desmond was, unmistakably, the second kind, and Reuben had recognized this within the first 30 seconds of the boy walking through his door. The careful way he held the small box containing the watch, the specific tension in his shoulders, the visible effort it was taking him to keep his composure as he approached the counter. Reuben examined the watch carefully, the way he examined everything, turning it over in his hands under the bright lamp he kept beside the register specifically for this kind of inspection. A habit built from decades of needing to accurately assess value in order to run a business that survived on the margin between what he paid for items and what he could resell them for. He recognized immediately that the watch was a genuinely well-made piece, a mechanical movement that had clearly been properly maintained over its lifetime. The kind of item that held real value beyond whatever sentimental weight it carried for the person selling it. The kind of craftsmanship that simply was not made the same way anymore. He asked Desmond, as he asked most people bringing in items of this nature, what the story behind it was, a question he never rushed and rarely skipped. This was not, strictly speaking, necessary for the transaction, but Reuben had found over 23 years that asking the question often changed how he approached the actual negotiation. That understanding what an item represented to the person selling it helped him calibrate not just the price he offered, but the entire texture of the interaction. Desmond told him, in the careful and economical sentences of someone trying not to let his voice break in front of a stranger, his eyes mostly fixed on the counter rather than on Reuben's face, about his father, about the watch's origin with his grandfather in 1968, about the 14 months of illness and the 11 days since the funeral and the rent due in 4 days and the insurance payout still weeks away. Reuben listened to all of this without interrupting, his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, his hands folded together on the counter, the watch resting on a small velvet pad between them, catching the light from the shop's overhead fixtures. When Desmond finished, Reuben was quiet for a moment, looking at the watch and then back at the boy in front of him, and then he named a price, $450, more than Desmond had expected, enough to cover the rent with a small margin left over. But Reuben did something else as well, something that was not, strictly speaking, part of his standard business practice, but that he had developed. Over the years, a specific personal policy around applied selectively to the situations that seemed to genuinely warrant it. He told Desmond that he was going to write up the transaction as a standard pawn rather than an outright sale, which meant that Desmond would have 90 days to repay the loan amount, plus a modest interest fee and reclaim the watch, rather than having sold it outright and permanently. He explained that most pawn transactions worked this way regardless, that outright sales were actually less common than the popular understanding of pawn shops suggested, but he made a point of explaining it carefully to Desmond, of making sure the boy understood that this was not goodbye to the watch unless Desmond decided it needed to be. He also told Desmond, in a tone that was deliberately matter-of-fact rather than sentimental, understanding that excessive emotion in this moment might tip Desmond over an edge he was visibly working hard to stay away from, that he would hold the watch carefully, that it would be kept in his secure storage rather than on display where it might catch some other customer's interest, and that whenever Desmond was in a position to come back for it, whether that was within the 90 days or if Desmond needed more time and asked for an extension, well beyond it, the watch would be there waiting for him. Desmond left the shop with $450 folded carefully into his jacket pocket and a pawn ticket tucked beside it, and a specific feeling that he would later describe, when he eventually told this story to people close to him, as the strange combination of relief and grief existing simultaneously in the same moment, the practical crisis of the rent solved and a different, less immediately solvable loss settling into its place. Sitting heavily in his chest the entire walk home, he paid the rent. The insurance payout arrived eventually 7 weeks later, and Desmond used a portion of it, the first thing he did with the money once it cleared, to return to Delmar Avenue and redeem the watch. paying back the loan amount plus the accumulated interest. A transaction that took perhaps 10 minutes and that left him standing on the sidewalk outside the pawn shop with his father's watch back on his wrist, where it remained every day for the following 6 years. This would have been, in itself, a complete and satisfying story. A young man navigating a genuine financial crisis with resourcefulness and care. A pawn shop owner extending a specific and meaningful grace within the bounds of his ordinary business practice. A watch reclaimed and a family heirloom preserved. But the actual story did not end there, because what happened over the following 6 years was something neither Desmond nor Reuben could have fully anticipated on the day of that first transaction. Desmond finished his engineering degree 2 years after his father's death, graduating with the same scholarship that had carried him through, supplemented by additional work and a tighter budget than he would have chosen, but that he managed through the specific discipline his father had modeled for him across 19 years of careful and unglamorous financial management. He took a job with a manufacturing engineering firm in St. Louis, work that paid reasonably well and that put him on a clear professional trajectory, the kind of stability that had been, for most of his childhood, something his father had worked toward without ever fully achieving for himself. What Desmond did, in the years following his father's death, that connected him back to Reuben Castellano's pawn shop in a way neither of them had anticipated, was return periodically, not to pawn anything, but simply to talk. The first return visit, about 4 months after he had redeemed the watch, had been almost accidental. Desmond walking past the shop on his way to somewhere else and finding himself, on impulse, stepping inside to thank Reuben again for the way he had handled the original transaction, a gesture of gratitude that Desmond had been carrying since that first day, but had not had occasion to fully express. Reuben, who remembered Desmond clearly, the specific story of the watch and the grandfather, and the careful way the boy had held his composure while explaining a circumstance that would have broken many people, was glad to see him, and what began as a brief thank-you visit extended into a longer conversation. Reuben asking how Desmond's studies were going, Desmond asking about the shop, the kind of easy mutual curiosity that exists between two people who have shared a meaningful moment and find themselves, somewhat to their own surprise, interested in continuing to know each other. This became, over the following years, an irregular but genuine pattern. Desmond would stop by the shop every few months, sometimes more often, sometimes less, depending on the specific demands of his coursework and later his career. Reuben, who had lost his own son to a car accident 15 years earlier, a son who would have been roughly Desmond's age had he lived, a loss that Desmond learned about gradually, in pieces across several of these conversations, found in Desmond's periodic visits, something he had not expected to find again at this stage of his life. A relationship with a younger person that carried some of the texture of the relationship he had lost, without ever being presented by either of them as a replacement for what Reuben's own son had been, an important distinction that both men seemed to understand instinctively and respect without ever needing to discuss it directly. Reuben taught Desmond, across these years of irregular visits, things about the watch business and about mechanical objects generally that connected, in ways Desmond found himself genuinely interested in, to his own engineering education, the specific craft of horology, the careful mechanical logic of how a well-made watch actually functioned, the tiny tolerances and precisely machined components that made the difference between a piece that would last decades and one that would fail within years, knowledge that Reuben had accumulated across more than 4 decades around the shop, first watching his own father work and then developing his own expertise through years of patient practice and the occasional costly mistake that had taught him more than any success could have. Desmond, in turn, brought a younger person's energy and technical curiosity to these conversations that Reuben found himself genuinely enjoying, an exchange of knowledge and company that benefited both of them in ways neither had specifically sought out. 6 years after the original transaction, on what happened to be the anniversary of his father's death, though this had not been deliberately planned, Desmond walked into the pawn shop carrying a folder rather than a watch, and asked Reuben if he had a few minutes to talk about something specific. What Desmond had come to propose, developed over the previous several months through a combination of his own savings, now substantial after 6 years of steady engineering income and careful management, and a genuine desire to do something meaningful with both his gratitude toward Reuben and his memory of his father, was a scholarship fund established at the local community college, specifically designated for students facing the kind of sudden financial crisis Desmond had faced at 19. Students whose education was at risk not from lack of ability or effort, but from the specific and unpredictable financial shocks that family illness, death, or other emergencies could create. He wanted to name it, he told Reuben, the Okafor Castellano Fund, a combination of his father's name and Reuben's, a gesture that Desmond explained carefully was meant to honor both the original gift of the watch from his grandfather to his father and the specific grace Reuben had extended 6 years earlier that had allowed Desmond to navigate his own crisis without permanently losing the physical connection to that inheritance. Reuben, hearing this proposal, found himself unable to speak for a long moment, his reading glasses sliding slightly down his nose as he looked at the folder in front of him without quite seeing it. The specific weight of being honored in this way, by a young man whose life had intersected with his own through what had begun as a routine transaction and become, across 6 years, something closer to family, settling into him with a force he had not anticipated when Desmond first sat down across the counter that afternoon. He said yes. He asked if he could contribute to the fund as well, not as the namesake gesture Desmond had already offered him, but as a genuine financial contribution, and Desmond, understanding that this request came from the same place as everything else Reuben had done across the years of their relationship, the specific instinct to participate rather than simply receive, agreed. The fund was established that year and has, in the time since, helped 11 students complete degrees they would otherwise have had to abandon, each of them facing some version of the crisis Desmond had faced at 19, a parent's sudden illness, a family emergency that drained whatever savings existed, the specific and unpredictable financial shocks that can derail an education overnight, and each of them receiving not just financial support, but when they wanted it, the specific mentorship that both Desmond and Reuben had come to believe mattered as much as the money itself, the understanding that someone who had survived a similar crisis was available to talk to offer the kind of practical and emotional guidance that a financial award alone could not provide. Desmond still wears his father's watch every day, the same piece his grandfather had saved a year's wages to buy in 1968, still keeping time the way it had for more than half a century. He has, in the years since establishing the fund, begun a tradition of bringing each new scholarship recipient to meet Reuben at the shop, not as a formal requirement but as an invitation. A chance for these students to understand the specific story behind the fund that was helping them, the watch and the grandfather and the 11 days and the $450 and the grace of a pawn shop owner who had chosen, on an ordinary afternoon in March, to treat a 19-year-old's crisis with more care than the transaction strictly required, a choice that Reuben himself, on his more reflective days, says he never thought of as remarkable at the time, only as the obvious thing to do. Before you go, I want to leave you with the specific shape of what this story actually contains. A watch is, in the end, just an object, a mechanical device for telling time, and the $450 Desmond received for it was, in the end, just money. The kind of ordinary transaction that happens in pawn shops across the country every single day. What made this particular transaction different was not the object or the amount, but the specific quality of attention Reuben Castellano brought to a young man's crisis. The decision to ask the story rather than simply process the transaction. The choice to structure the deal in a way that left a door open rather than closing it permanently. The years of continued relationship that grew, unplanned and unforced, from that single afternoon of genuine care. Desmond did not just get his watch back. He got, across the following 6 years, something closer to a second father figure, a relationship that eventually grew large enough to help 11 other young people navigate their own versions of the crisis he had faced. Tell me in the comments, has a stranger's small kindness during your hardest moment ever grown into something you could not have predicted? I want to hear your story. And if this moved you, share it today with someone who needs to remember that the way we treat people in their worst moments can echo for years. Subscribe and turn on the bell. The next story is coming. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.